Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome, or good morning, and welcome to this Threat Connect webinar, Cyber Risk Quantification, a practical guide for the C-suite. That's really hard to say. First of all, we'll wait a few minutes for some more people to join. I can see lots of people are starting to join. So we'll give a few seconds for them all to settle in, and then we'll begin by introducing our two presenters today. Jerry, do you want to start? Do you want to quickly introduce yourself and Threat Connect?
Sure. I'm the one who we will see wandering around trying to find the best light here in my office as I try and figure out how to do this. So if it's moving, it's, after a year and a half, 2 years of this, I still try and find the good light. I'm Jerry, by the way. Nice to meet you. VP of Cyber Risk Strategy here at Threat Connect. Personally, I've been working in the risk quantification space for most of the last 7 years. And my job here at Threat Connect is to help us drive where we go from a risk perspective strategically. Threat Connect is a company that really focuses on three things. It focuses on being able to provide risk quantification, automation and orchestration, and threat intelligence, our threat intelligence platform, really with a goal and a mission of changing how security is done for the business to drive risk and threat together with automated response. That's me. I'm very excited to be here with our partner, Benazir. And Benazir, I'll ask you to introduce yourself as well, too.
Oh, sounds great. Thank you so much, Jerry and Sausan. A big hello to all of you. I'm Benazir Darwala. I'm the founder and principal partner at CyberMinds Consulting. We are a management consulting boutique based out of Brooklyn, New York, and we specialize in cyber advisory services that focus mostly across the CISO priority domains or use cases. Applied cyber risk management and cyber risk quantification is one of our flagship offerings within the portfolio. Thank you for joining us today. It's going to be fun.
Fantastic. Thank you both for introducing yourselves and your organizations. Just before we move on to the agenda, I just want to run through a few housekeeping just for you to all be aware of to make sure you get the best webinar experience possible. You'll see that there are two handouts. There's a Threat Connect datasheet and a CyberMinds datasheet. Please feel free to download those and have a look in your own time, but we hope you find those interesting. Also, today's session will be a discussion, so we welcome any questions, comments, any ideas you have, any opinions you have. Please post them as we go through this webinar, and we will try and read out as many of them as we can, but we want this to be really, really interactive. There'll also be a poll sort of midway through, so we'd love to get your feedback there as well. And finally, at the end of the webinar, there'll be a short 2-minute survey. If you could just take a few moments just to fill that out, we'd be really keen to understand what your thoughts were on the session and also how we can improve. So on that note, I will hand over to Jerry, who will quickly talk us through the agenda and the current state of cyber risk quantification.
Sure, thanks, Sausan. Again, thank you all for being here. We love talking about cyber risk quantification, and as Sausan mentioned, our goal here is to share some practical advice about a bunch of different things. One is the current state of cyber risk quantification, where are we at, how are people working in terms of adoptions, what are we hearing from the market, from partners from everywhere, and then really with a goal towards helping operationalizing cyber risk quantification, giving some tips and then obviously answering questions along the way. Sausan undersold one piece of this whole introduction, in that it has the Q&A piece. Please fire away with questions. She's great at making sure questions are asked during the presentation, so you will hear from her as well too. She's not just turning over the reins to me, because that would be a very bad idea. So that's what we're going to talk about, and I'm excited to be able to do this and have Benazir and Sausan here with us as well too. So why don't we jump right in and go talk about the current state of cyber risk quantification. So sharing a slide from Gartner, we got this a couple of months ago, and I was pleasantly surprised to see this. So as I mentioned, I've been tracking cyber risk quantification for years. It's become a passion area of mine, and we saw this from Gartner, and it was like all of a sudden, right at the top of the hype cycle, you see cyber risk quantification, and I was like, wow, that's really awesome. So we got on the phone with Gartner, been having a lot of conversations, and it's really interesting to see cyber risk quantification really start to become one of those topics that is talked about more and more and more. I've seen an uptick over the last 12, 6, 12, 18 months in terms of people really starting to ask questions. Now, I'll be candid. Most people don't ask and they go, ooh, I want cyber risk quantification. What they end up asking for are things like, hey, I'm reading about ransomware attacks and oh my goodness, are the losses growing? What are we doing about this? What is our exposure? Or they see that the budget for security keeps growing and growing and growing and they go, hey, why are we spending so much money on this? Or what are we doing? How come we can't be more secure, or why aren't we secure? And so I think you're starting to see the recognition in terms of the current state of the market of cyber risk quantification start to really build and really head there towards the point of it's past time to start doing something like this. I think the other thing I'm starting to see, which is also feeding into the movement behind cyber risk quantification, kind of being at the top of that hype cycle, is the cyber insurance space. Everybody I talk to tells me on the insurance side tells me that the premiums are going to go up, the restrictions on policies are getting tighter, and it's becoming a really, really hard market. I think we've seen insurance carriers start to restrict the coverages they'll offer. We're seeing the big guys start to go, maybe we shouldn't be doing this, because the financial impacts are changing. So in terms of, and look, I have to cut myself off because I could talk about this for a few days, and I want to get to the good stuff that we've got lined up with Benazir. But I think from a current state perspective, we're seeing the momentum build, and I like being at the top of the hill because skiing down the top of the hill is easier than walking up a hill. And it is cold here in Maryland, so I'm going to use the cold analogy. So Benazir, that's kind of what I'm seeing. I'm not sure, what you're seeing in terms of current state, but that's my general view on current state. I don't know if you want to add to that or contradict me as well too. I'm fine with that.
Oh, I can do that. Actually, that's a good perspective, right? So I believe everybody who's here on the call today or in the industry in general has bought into the benefits of cyber risk quantification, right? So that's not the selling point we're trying to get to here. However, what I have observed personally and talking to analysts as well is there's a kind of a nagging perception in the industry that CRQ is a very complex topic. Right? So if it's so complex, then why go there? Like, for example, if you look at quantitative risk models as the ones promoted by FAIR Institute, they look highly complicated on paper. Forget about the implementation. And usually when the amount of time and effort that is required in driving a cyber risk quantification program, an effective cyber risk quantification program, can be enormous. In fact, I was talking to an industry analyst a couple of days ago, and he mentioned that the industry is at least 2 years behind successfully adopting CRQ. And he raised some important points there. One point where we are seeing inhibitors to adoption of CRQ quickly, in spite of the known benefits, is there's a lack of complete understanding. There's a lack of expertise in regards to how to make CRQ work. And it's a fact, right? We are technologists. We work in a very technology-focused domain. We are not financial planners or financial analysts, so we don't play the numbers game very well. So there's always that area which is not necessarily a sweet spot. But he also raised an important point that the organization CIO and the CISO teams have not spent enough time in trying to understand how their business works. So without the clear understanding of the business, how do we expect those leaders to talk a language in business terms? So there is a kind of a pushback, because maybe talking the language of business is not necessarily the sweet spot or within the comfort zone. And these are some fair observations, but in my opinion, it doesn't have to necessarily be this way, right? It doesn't have to be so difficult. It doesn't have to be complex. Like everything else, CRQ is basically a journey, right? You start small and you build big. Organizations can take small, simpler steps to adoption of CRQ, and in the process, demonstrate the value, demonstrate the benefits across the organization, and in the process, improve that cross-functional collaboration by incorporating stakeholder participation. So I totally agree with you that we are at a point that we have to start reaping the benefits of CRQ, but there's also some kind of a pushback either due to the lack of understanding or because the leaders, especially technical leaders, are not very comfortable talking the language of business. And frankly speaking, you don't necessarily need to do business, know everything about the business to be able to start the CRQ journey, which I believe gets into the next slide. Any comments on that?
So I want to add one thing because I love that. It's funny when you said that. I was on a call this morning with one of our customers, and she was describing. She says one of the challenges she has internally is going to the business and getting an understanding of what things are worth in the business. Pure business conversation. She goes, I get pushback. I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what you're saying is absolutely right. And I'm a big fan of changing mindsets. Like, if I can't win a game, I'm going to kind of try and either play a different game or change the rules. And so I suggested changing the game. I said, why don't you do this? Why don't you imagine you're about to go into the meeting with your bosses, and the outcome of the meeting should be, hey, we need to move forward, and here's how. And one of the ways simply to do that is to say, we're not sure what the value of this part of the business is. So you give them three options. You say, if the business is worth this much, here's the risk. If it's worth this much, here's the risk. If it's worth this much, here's the risk. And what you do is you get the business to say, well, I think it's between that one, that one. Go talk to the person in finance to get that. You start the ball rolling to your journey conversation. That's how we need to stop thinking that we need to have everything before we start, and start realizing that this conversation needs to happen now because it's imperative for our businesses. Anyway.
Exactly. And as you, to your point, baby steps at a time. You start small, you build big, right? And in the process, you learn, and in the process, you gain broader buy-in within the enterprise, within the organization. Correct. Yeah. Next slide, I guess.
Hear more about these customer experiences, so we'll try and sprinkle these throughout. But before we do get into that, I think it's important to touch upon the adoption of cyber risk quantification so far. So as you can see here, traditionally organizations have measured risks using qualitative methods and are now transitioning to the quantitative. It'd be good to know, both Joe, from your perspective, and also Benazir, what you're seeing in the market today and how you see it maturing, how you've seen it mature this year and how you see it evolving next year.
I'll give you my 2 cents, and then Benazir can give the real value. I see risk quantification becoming optimized, and almost, our goal is to automate to the 80 to 95% range, because there's no way you can automate everything. I think Benazir said it well, is that it's a journey. I think the end of the journey really becomes an environment where cyber risk is quantified on a regular basis in an automated fashion, because you've optimized what that looks like for the business. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it requires a lot of stuff. That's, to be candid, that's what folks like us work on. This is what we spend our days and nights thinking about. And I think that's where we need to get to, the point where we're automated. I think the journey, though, is absolutely manual, automated, and optimized, and that is the key. The qualitative thing is interesting, because I've been spending a lot more time talking to folks about qualitative assessments and how that fits in. And the answer is, it fits in perfectly to a cyber risk quantification adoption as well, too, because it never goes away. Remember, I'm a big believer. I have books on my desk here about super forecasting, and I'm a big fan of like 538 Politics. They talk about model building all the time. It's the nerdy stuff I listen to. And the one thing I always tell people when it comes to qualitative versus quantitative risk is the two work together. The one mistake people make is they make a mistake of saying, I want to model these scenarios from a risk perspective. And that's not wrong, but if you model these set of risks in this context, how do you know you're getting the right ones? So I see this optimization of risk, where you're looking at risk across the business and then using qualitative assessments and some manual labor to go deeper into the key scenarios that the automation has shown you this is where you should be working on. Because until you get that broad brush painted for you, the value to the organization is lower and your stakeholder involvement is lower. And then using this journey, this adoption curve here, you get to the point of optimization, but it feeds into the qualitative assessments too, or I should say the qualitative assessments feed into some of the additional depth and context that you can get. And so I'm starting to see this blending of the two, but using qualitative assessments in a more correct, a more correct and applicable manner as part of this journey. Benazir, I know you've seen a lot of these as well too. Where are you on this?
So I'll make a comment there, right? And it aligns with what you're just saying, right? That qualitative assessments are a de facto standard. Every organization uses it, and every organization uses it to make decisions around where they want to and how they want to invest in cyber. Now, there are benefits to qualitative assessments. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to switch, everything is now going to be quantitative, right? So the qualitative has its own benefits in certain areas. However, the problem with qualitative assessments is it is not objective enough to help you measure how much risk exists within an enterprise or even within a smaller domain area, right? How much risk exists and how the risk levels change as you implement new controls or as new events get triggered, right? So it doesn't necessarily is giving you an objective measurement of your risk and your overall risk posture, inherent risk or residual risk. So that's one element. Where I'm actually seeing is organizations have realized that the outputs of the qualitative assessments may not just be enough from a prioritization point of view. So one common use case which addresses the point you raised around the blending and the combined and an augmented model between qualitative and quantitative is a use case where you take the outcome of the qualitative assessment and you feed it into some kind of quantitative evaluation. And this specifically works when you are focusing on an area where you need more accurate and confident decision making. For example, you're working with competing business priorities. Where do you know where you want to put your resources or invest in? In that case, that quantitative analysis, quantitative assessments can provide some more clarity and provide some more guidance. And because it's scientific and data-driven, it raises the confidence level in terms of where you want to invest and how you want to invest. Now, I've been talking to a CISO, and they are currently in the manual quantitative phase, where they are looking at doing quantitative analysis for a handful of critical applications. And the reason the CISO mentioned he wants to do it is, number one, it helps them understand how does risk quantification work. So basically, it's like a learning curve for them, because they're trying to understand all the components involved in CRQ. And at the same time, what they're trying to do is get the output and the results of the CRQ process to raise awareness, because pictures speak 1,000 words, right? You can talk abstract, or you can show the value of CRQ by just producing a simple dashboard and report to the business or your stakeholders in order to gain a broader, wider buy-in. So that's one element where I'm seeing the qualitative and quantitative risk models are aligning in the sense that they're still manual, they're still using spreadsheets, they're still doing data collection, they're still doing data analysis manually. It's still resource intensive, but at least it gives them, it helps them test the waters around what goes into a successful CRQ program and how much effort is needed and how we can use the outcomes to gain a broader buy-in. From an automated point of view, what I have seen is, of course, once you are all bought into the benefits of CRQ, the next level is how do we optimize it operationally, right? I mean, you can continue doing manual resource-intensive effort if you have the resources to do it, or you could automate the process either through your own homegrown tool, or you can go and acquire advanced technology such as Threat Connect CRQ in order to automate and achieve operational efficiency. And in that automated world, I'm also seeing that a lot of organizations are focusing on formalizing and defining CRQ within specific areas under the CISO groups. For example, a client I'm working with, they want to formalize CRQ as a part of the security architecture practice. So every time a new application is onboarded, or every time a new application wants to get into production, before that, they make it go through risk quantification evaluation so that they can clearly understand the loss exposures, they can clearly understand the business impact, and then, of course, mitigate it with the right level of controls before the application gets into production. So they are only using CRQ for a small subset of the overall CISO program, but it does help them in gaining, not only, of course, it's a learning curve for them, but also allows them to start formalizing it as a part of existing disciplines within the organization. And of course, optimized is, sorry?
I was going to say, it'd be interesting to know at this stage where the audience are currently at. But do you want to talk a little bit about optimized, or should we run the poll?
No, just on it. At the end of the day, right, the ideal is to get to the nirvana, the ideal state where CRQ is an enterprise-wide discipline well integrated with your existing ERM programs, the CRO and the CFO risk dashboards, and in the process also enrich with operational intelligence, third-party intelligence, as well as the vulnerability intelligence, as well as your own operational context and business objectives. So you start small and build big. Not everybody is going to build big right from day one, but at least there is a journey to get there over a period of time. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's do that then. Let's launch the poll and find out where everyone's at. So hopefully right now you see a poll has popped up on your screen. And the question is, what stage is your organization at? Is it the quantitative that we mentioned? Is it the manual quantitative, so you're just starting out? Automated quantitative or optimized quantitative? While we wait for the results of this poll to come in, I don't know if you guys have any predictions. Benazir, do you have any predictions here?
I'm going to wear my optimistic hat. I'm a very optimistic person. So I'm going to say majority of organizations are between combined effort between qualitative and manual quantitative. That would be my prediction.
We should have had that hybrid as an option.
You should have. I'm going to pretend there's only one that I can pick. And I'm going to say qualitative because I've seen more and more of that. I'd like to see more on the quantitative, but I'm going to go with the underdog here and go qualitative.
No,
perfect.
Well, we'll wait for those results to come in, but actually, I think regardless of what the results do come out to be, if they're at the qualitative stage, but they recognize the importance of quantitative, hopefully by the end of this webinar, they'll have some practical tips to get started. So bright side.
It's funny when one of the things, and Benazir, you said it well when you talked about it. One of the things I'm starting to work and help people on is they're trying to make the leap from qualitative to quantitative, and they're struggling because they're like, we have all this data qualitatively, and they're like, how does this apply quantitatively? And I got to be candid. The answer is sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I think part of the challenge is people are thinking about qualitatively, like, well, I've got, some people will tell me, like, I've only got 3 people who use the system on every other week, and therefore that reduces, that increases our defenses. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. That's not a control. That's not a defense. I think part of what we're seeing is as people move from qualitative to quantitative is getting a better understanding of what factors really influence risk and where factors influence risk as well too. Woohoo, I won, but I didn't really win.
There we have it.
Between qualitative and manual quantitative. So.
Oh, you cheated. You picked both.
You picked both.
Perfect. Well, no, it's interesting to see where organizations are at. And I think if we run this poll in 12 months' time, we'll definitely start seeing more people around the manual quantitative and automated quantitative. But just cautious of time, what I want to do is actually jump to the real juicy part of this discussion. So we want to talk about what we're hearing in the market, and I really want to give you both an opportunity to tell us, what you've seen throughout your experiences. So over the next 20-ish minutes, we'll be talking about what we hear from CIOs, CFOs, CISOs, and we'll start with CISOs. It's on the screen now. These are some of the things that we've been hearing. I don't know, Jerry, is there any one that you want to pick up on and talk a little bit about? Any of these?
Talk about them all. I want to talk about them all. They're all
Pick
good.
Anyone?
I think these are all really good. But I don't want to pick one that you're going to pick because I know we talked about it and I already forgot which one I want to pick, but I like them all.
No, pick anyone. That's okay.
So it's interesting. The where do I start one? I literally had a call about an hour and a half ago with one of our customers, and she's still struggling to know where to start. It's not only where to start, it's how to start as well too. And again, I think this goes back to the adoption. I think the adoption for CRQ from a CISO perspective is doubly challenging because a lot of CISOs are becoming the business leaders that they're being forced into, and having to have this conversation. A friend of mine's a CISO for a company, and he and I've worked together for years on this, and he's been a great influence in kind of what I'm doing. And he's like, look, the number one thing he tries to do with his organization is he sets a 3-year roadmap, and he goes, here's what I'm doing, and here's the quantification process I'm putting in place so that he can communicate better. And so I said, well, how do you know where to start? And he goes, look, I don't, to be candid. He doesn't know where to start. The organization is big. It's like asking, how do you boil the ocean when you have a match? He goes, what I've done very well over the years is started to realize I have a cup, and I take a scoop of water out of the ocean, and I start there, and I let that journey begin. So in his case, he actually has kind of one crown jewel application that matters most to the business. And he goes, I'm starting there. And he literally starts with that one. And he starts with imperfect information, not everything he wants, but he starts. And I had this very similar conversation with a woman this morning, and she's like, we've got, actually, I'll ask a question. I would love to know the answer to this question for the audience. So I talked to the third person in the last week who's told me this, that they have multiple copies of the same thing everywhere in their business, whether it be an application or data, multiple copies of the same thing. And she's trying to convince the business that, hey, we shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing it differently. I'm not kidding. I've heard this from healthcare, from finance, from every sector does this, seem to copy things. And so she was like, I don't know where to start. I said, well, look, what you do is you start with the outcome you want to drive, right? She wants to drive, and everybody I talked to, I said, you want to drive the conversation that says, are we okay with this risk or not? Security is not a no. Security cannot be Dr. No. Security has to be yes with an if. Yes, if. So where do you start? If you don't know everything, you start with you know what, if you go to your boss, you go to your peers and say, are we okay with this kind of risk for this kind of system in this kind of environment? It can be that narrow. And the answer should be yes with an if or no with a but. And then you go from there. So you don't have to know everything. You can start very, very small and then grow that. And I promise you, once you start, the plan you have in your mind will change because people start asking you questions. You find yourself going that way and that way and that way, and it'll snowball in a good way. But I'm going to stop talking because I could talk about this one for days. So Benazir, which one? I hope I didn't pick the one you wanted to think.
No, totally. I mean, I was just going to get there, right? Critical apps. Pick up a couple of your critical apps because you're in control of your apps, right? You know technology, you know your critical apps. Try to run a risk quantification evaluation through your critical apps, see the outcomes, and then you automatically get the buy-in because there's so much insights that you can derive that your quality assessments do not necessarily provide, right? So definitely a good answer there, Jerry. The one I will pick up is how do we make the outcomes consumable and actionable? A lot of these risk quantification outcomes can be very abstract, right? How do you make it unique? How do you make it actionable and consumable to your organization? And as a service provider, we recommend a couple of things. You can take the outcomes of the risk quantification process and use it to create short-term and long-term controls implementation plan. And not just creating a controls implementation plan, but aligning the controls implementation plan to your current business priorities and your current CISO priorities as well. For example, a CRQ process may say you need to implement control A or control B. Now, control A may contribute to the current business objectives of you wanting to move all your legacy or modernize your legacy applications into cloud. Or it could address a CISO priority that could suggest that they want to implement zero trust. So what you could do is get the outcomes of the CRQ, create an understanding of what are the near-term objectives and the long-term objectives that can help you mitigate. And then, of course, align it also to your current and CISO as well as CIO priorities, because it will help you make more informed and more objective decisions around the benefits and the value early on in the process than later during the process. So that's a common conversation that comes up whenever we look at taking the results of the CRQ process and making it actionable within an organization.
Absolutely. you're a CISO on this webinar and there's something holding you back, or you're still on qualitative, maybe you're looking to move to quantitative, it would be interesting for us to know what's holding you back, or what are the challenges you've been facing, because we can read them out anonymously, of course. But it'd be interesting just to make sure that if there is anything that we haven't necessarily covered here, and bear in mind this is just an example of some of the things that we've heard. Perfect. Is there anything else we want to touch upon for the CISOs and things we've heard from CISO conversations?
I think we already touched a common question that comes up. We have used qualitative assessments until now. Why CRQ? Why now? Of course, there are a lot of different things that are thrown at the CISO. They have so many different priorities to juggle with. There's evolving threat landscape. There's competing business priorities. There's operational inefficiencies. Then there's a constant demand for additional spend in terms of investment, in terms of people. How do you prioritize? The qualitative assessment does not give you that level of visibility in terms of prioritization and cost-benefit analysis or ROI. So you need to use a scientific data-based approach that CRQ provides in order to make those informed, objective decisions. So that's a common question that crops up a lot as well.
Lovely. Well, we've had actually a few questions to come in, so this might be a good opportunity just to answer a few of those. Of course, any we don't get to, we will come to at the end. But someone says, how do you deal with multiple controls that mitigate the same threat or risk from the point of view their contributory effect? From the point of view of their that's a hard word to say.
No, it's a great question. So our view is that, and the way we've looked at this over the years, and we believe the data supports this, is when you look at cyber risk, there's really two pieces of the puzzle you need to look at. You need to look at the financial impact, and then you need to look at the likelihood of the attacker actually breaching your systems in the first place. And the reason is because most companies have money they spent on defenses. So in terms of controls, what you really want to look at is you really want to look at controls against controls exist to prevent an attacker from doing something, a bad person from doing something in your environment. That's why we have controls. If you ask anybody why they have antivirus or an endpoint running on their desktop, it's so that people can't launch attacks, can't do this, can't do that. So controls writ large in our world are really really provide the ability to prevent an attacker from doing something, or they can increase the ability of the attacker to do something. How can they increase it? Don't have a control. Have a control poorly configured. So we've looked at controls internally and said, well, the reality is there are the controls mapped to like the MITRE attack framework, for example, and they either make a tactic more likely to succeed or inhibit its success. And when you look at cyber risk, you can't look at it in a linear, I've got a control in place, therefore I am secure. You actually have to look at it from an attack path perspective. And so we built our solution. We said, look, let's look at controls as they apply to different stages in an attack path, because this question is spot on. You might have a great control that mitigates a certain kind of tactic early on in an attack phase, but might be terrible later on, as a simple example. And so you have to look at controls against the tactics that are available to the attacker in the totality of the attack chain. Otherwise you're just getting a really weird narrow view, and you're getting an overconfident, I'd argue, overconfident answer when you really don't have the answer in the first place. This is a great question, though.
I've got another question.
I would just add to that, right? So when you look at controls, you just don't look at controls in a silo, right? You look at controls, you look at the impact of the controls and the contribution of controls across multiple business processes or applications. That's how you would prioritize, because that's how you can gain maximum aggregated risk reduction. So to your point, if there is one control that mitigates, or I think the question was, there are multiple controls that mitigate the same threat, they may not necessarily have the same impact in the mitigation of threat. And to Jerry's point around the attack patterns, right? For example, a multi-factor authentication control has a very high efficacy in terms of mitigating fraud or mitigating stolen credentials attack, compared perhaps to adaptive authentication, which is potentially a secondary control. So I think part of the process is also to make the objectives more actionable and consumable, and that's an exercise you may want to do as a part of what we call as controls categorization and controls efficacy. We do it as a part of a service engagement, but it's something that organizations can implement themselves. And there are primary controls, secondary controls, good to have, must have, need to have, right? So those can potentially help in that decision-making process. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
No, that's good. And there's another question that's come in is, how do you determine asset value, e.g. CI value?
And Azir, you want to start with that one, or?
No, I mean, it depends on what kind of quantitative models you're using. I can let you answer. You do that very well.
So it's interesting. How do you determine asset value? You know, it's actually interesting. That's the right question. And I say that because we believe that cyber risk quantification should be done by asking value, not risk. Very specific with my words there. So we believe that you should be able to start by asking the question of what is, I'll say it a little more verbosely, what is available for the attacker to impact? What is the value of the business asset to impact? I assume that's where this is going. Because what we found is you can go into your business folks, you can go into accounting, finance, your risk folks and say, hey, you know, we've got a production system here. How much revenue does it generate to the organization? They can tell you approximately or accurately. So it's a historical looking item. What they can't do is they can't tell you what you think the risk would be unless you've already had to deal with an attack, in which, God bless you, I feel for you. But even then, is that data accurate for the next modeling? I don't know. So in terms of value, we're actually looking at that value question. And we found there's a couple of things, and I'm going to cut myself short here. I'll talk about this for a long time. Keep the conversation at the business value level for what people understand, and then work on interpreting that into your environment. So for example, revenue is a great question to ask. How much revenue generates through a system, or how much data is stored there? Very easy items to do. If you're trying to get into I don't know where this question is going. If you're trying to get into how much is an actual asset worth, how much is a phone worth from a business perspective, how much is a laptop worth from a business perspective, my suggestion will be to stop, put your pencils down, and don't try and do that, because it will not work. We looked at that early on and found that that was an untenable way to try and calculate that answer. So I'm not exactly sure where this is going, but I think if this is going down the path, I think it's going down determining asset value. I'd argue you start with the business assets, you tie the technical assets to that satisfy the business assets. So again, I got a e-commerce server, I got a production system. There is technical assets that comprise that business asset. The technical risk exists at the technical level, the business risk exists at the business level, and the thing you have to figure out is how to tie the technical to the business. That's where we kind of do that linkage, if you will. Because if you're trying to tie dollar value to an actual endpoint, don't.
That's not going to work.
No,
you're going to go around the rabbit hole. Yeah. Asset is all about the value to the business in terms of business process, business function. It could be application or data, right? So you have to elevate that conversation at that level. You can't look at it at the CI level, which is what the question was. So, and that's how you can drive the value out of CRQ. Otherwise, you're going to get into a rabbit hole, which will be a never-ending process. It's all about business context at the end of the day. CRQ is all about protecting the business outcomes. Without business context, there's no value, right? So that is critical in determining at what level you want to determine the asset value.
Perfect. On that note, let's go over to CIOs. So these are some of the things that we've heard from CIOs. And of course, if you're a CIO on this webinar today, feel free to let us know what you're thinking and what's stopping you from adopting CRQ or some of the challenges that you've been having. We'll read some out, but perhaps we talk about some of these. Benazir, do you want to kick this one off? Are there any in particular that you want to highlight that you've heard in conversations you've had with CIOs?
There's one common question that comes up, right? Security takes too much of my time already. Won't this increase the burden? How we position this as CRQ is not necessarily increasing our burden, but helping you also optimize your resources to what you need to focus on first, right? Risk reduction where it matters. And I'm going to quote an industry expert in this space about they did an analysis where about 70 to 90% of the organizations are focusing on initiatives that are not necessarily high-risk initiatives. So basically, they are implementing objectives that, when you look at from a quantitative perspective, are not necessarily providing the same kind of risk reduction. So what that means is a wastage. You're focusing on initiatives that are not necessarily important to the business, and that means taking away from initiatives that are important to the business, and then, of course, putting them in the backlog or in the back burner. So one of the key insights that CRQ can provide is clearly understanding of the prioritization and cost-benefit analysis and the ROI from a business point of view in order to allocate the resources where it matters. So it helps you with reducing the burden and increasing the burden. And that would be my answer to that.
That's a good answer. The burden is a great point in there as well too. Typically security is, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 10% budget of the overall IT budget for an organization. Yet it's a noisy 5 to 10% of the overall IT budget for the organization as well too. So if you talk about efficiency and security and without hindering business objectives, one of the things I hear from CIOs is how much do I need to apply to security in the first place, right? Because the challenge they're trying to do is, look, let's be honest, we all need IT. Even the security people need IT. You ask a security person to do their job without Google, without searching, it can't be done. We all need IT. So IT is a key driver or enabler for the business. And the CIOs are struggling with, how do I know that balance of how much to apply to security without hindering the business objectives? And so I think CRQ, what we're starting to see from a CIO perspective is, CIOs for years have been focused on business value, financial value. It's a real easy thing to do to tie ROI to IT. Security has been that kind of outlier here. And I think what I'm starting to hear from more CIOs is the desire / need to tie security into the business value as well too. And so I love that they're starting to ask that question, because that is a reason to quantify cyber risk in financial terms, because it enables a CIO to say, well, it turns out that 10% of the budget, which is security, actually is helping reduce risk by X dollars. And here's how we translate that into value for the business. And so it increases efficiency if you can tie that conversation together.
Exactly, and that's exactly to our point around actionable and consumable, right? You can't make it actionable and consumable till you tie it back to the business objectives, right? So even though you might be doing an elaborate process to quantify risk, but at the end of the day, the question is it helping me grow my business over the next 2 years, right? Is it helping our corporate strategic priorities? Those are the difficult questions you want to answer, and linking the CRQ outcome back into the business objectives is a critical step in order to drive the success of the process itself within the organization, let alone the buying, right?
Someone's asking if this session will be recorded and if we'll get the slides sent out. The answer to that is yes. That will be recorded. Well, it is being recorded, and the slides will be sent out following the session within hopefully the next 24 hours. Cool. In that case, why don't we move on to the next one? There we go. Let's talk about what you're hearing from CFOs and CROs, and then we'll come on to some more questions that people have got. Who wants to kick this one off?
So I'll tell you a fun story about, well, I'm gonna tell a fun story about a CFO. So over the summer, I was on a family vacation, 4th of July, hanging out with family I've known for many, many, many years. And just happened to be having a conversation, and for some reason, we're having a conversation about somebody's new grandbaby. Oh, how cute, thankful it's not mine. I have enough children of my own. And so we're having a nice, fun conversation, and somehow we started talking about something, and he goes to me, he goes, what do you do? What exactly do you do? I said, oh, I work for a company, we cyber risk dollars. I said this generically because I didn't know what the guy did. I'd known him for 25 years, didn't know what he did. He goes, tell me a little bit more. And so I was like, oh, this is kind of what we do. And I said, why is this of interest to you? He goes, well, it turns out I'm the CFO for a very large public company. And one of the struggles I'm having is my CISO is giving me information, and I'm not sure exactly what it means. I'm not sure, is it ever enough? I'm not sure. And it was just fascinating to sit there and talk to a family friend who I've known forever, who was telling me that they're struggling with why, how much, what do I have to give security? Aren't we good? We've got check boxes for SOC and GDPR and that's all these. aren't we good? And it was just really fascinating to listen to that conversation, because we live in a bubble in security, right? We're like, oh my goodness, security, log4j, big bad things happening. What does this mean? We're so important. And the business people are standing there looking at us with straight faces going, I have no idea what you're telling me. I have zero clue if this is of value or how much value. Zippo. And it's just fascinating to hear the other side of the story. I wish everybody could have a conversation with somebody in the business and just ask them one question of, how are we doing? Go ask somebody in the business how you're doing, because they won't know how to answer you. And this is fascinating coming from the CFOs and CROs, because it really is key to the business. Anyway, just a fun story for me and the CFOs. I've done this for a lot of years. The first time I heard that kind of conversation. Benazir, why don't you pick one before
I think, as we say, right, cybersecurity is a boardroom topic, and they require you to talk their language. You can't continue to talk about vulnerabilities and log4j shell, right? You need to say, okay, what's the business impact? How is it going to jeopardize our existing corporate priorities, right? Those are the conversations we need to have, and that's what CRQ really helps. Now, one common question that comes up is, aren't we compliant with GDPR, ISO, blah, blah, blah? Why do we need to do a more rigorous discipline around CRQ? Now, if this question was asked about 2 or 3 years ago, I would say compliance doesn't guarantee security, or compliance doesn't guarantee risk reduction. But with the evolving compliance regulation and privacy regulation of the past couple of years, I think these regulations have become a little more prescriptive in helping organizations understand what they need to focus on in terms of their security risk posture or the overall risk posture. However, the problem with some of the compliance requirements are they are great prescriptive checklists. They don't necessarily guide you around how much risk are you going to be mitigating or reducing by implementing this control over the other, right? So, for example, GDPR talks very well about data security, talks about encryption, talks about anonymization. But at the end of the day, it doesn't answer the question. If you implement anonymization or you implement encryption, how much does it going to reduce your risk by? And that's where CRQ really helps, right? It helps you gain visibility into the loss exposures. It helps you gain visibility into the overall impacts due to the loss exposures and potential controls you want to implement in order to reduce those impacts. The other thing I also want to point out is when we talk about cyber risk quantification, cyber risk is no longer just an operational risk. It no longer cannot be categorized as an operational risk. Cyber attacks have far-reaching implications. Cyber risk is tied to a firm's existential value. A firm's existential value could be defined in terms of operational risk. It could be a financial risk. It could be a regulatory risk, which is where compliance and regulations help. It could be a reputational risk. It could be health and safety. It could be environmental ramification. You can't arbitrarily define cyber risk just as another operational risk. So the cyber risk quantification brings that important point forward, wherein you are evaluating not only the controls that you want to put in place, but how those controls are contributing to the overall risk posture in terms of business risk, in terms of what the company cares about. So that's important to understand. And that's a common question that keeps coming up. I am also seeing that we're going to see in the future, near future, more mandates and more regulations where organizations will be asked to have a more formal risk quantification processes, because it plays an important role in assessing the overall cybersecurity hygiene and cybersecurity maturity that feeds into a lot of different aspects, right? We spoke a little bit about insurance premiums already. Insurance premiums are not cheap. They're rising every day. And it will become very important for organizations to clearly understand the actual need for insurance premiums. And you can only understand the actual need when you know what your inherent risks are, what your residual risks are. The CRQ becomes a critical component and input into having those kind of negotiations when it comes to cyber risk coverage. So those are some of the insights that, or at least conversations I've had in the past, talking about how CRQ can benefit versus where we are, and how it complements versus assists in the current disciplines and processes that organizations already have in place.
Yeah, I love the insurance one. The insurance one, I'm having more conversations about that. I know we've talked a little bit about that. An old friend of mine once made the joke. He said, cyber insurance is kind of like life insurance. something everybody should have, but you might only get to use it once. So I promise you, if you're a CFO, if you're a CISO, you're having conversations already about security and insurance premiums because you're on the hook for some of those. I promise you, you'll have more detailed, more painful, more interrogative conversations about insurance and your posture in the next few months because it's getting harder to get insurance. It's costing more. And the CFO, look, the CFO's job is really important because everybody on this webinar and everybody I've ever spoken to in business likes getting paid. Very few of us do this just for the fun of it. So we all like the CFO when they pay us, but the CFO can't pay us if they don't have money to pay us. So if they spend more money on insurance, that moves money from elsewhere. I promise you, this is a conversation that is going to continue from their perspective because as premiums rise, they're going to have to start balancing risk more. Do I take lower insurance, but I spend more on security? You as security get the opportunity to be an enabler for them. And that's cool, right? You get to help out the CFOs to really make important strategic decisions for the business.
Got it. Totally, I totally agree. And you know, today the normal the approach to cyber risk insurance is, oh, we're just going to follow the industry benchmarks, and depending on the industry benchmarks or what our competitors are doing, will appropriately buy that level of cyber risk insurance or coverage. For me, insurance are all about managing and not necessarily transferring, but mitigating unanticipated risk, unplanned risk. And that needs to be accounted, and that's why you want something like a cyber risk insurance, while at the same time clearly understand what your loss exposures are, your inherent risks are, in order to negotiate what is actually needed for your organization.
Someone has actually just said, it's actually a really good question. It says, we've not yet started, but I would be keen to start these conversations. How long would you typically say it takes to start reaping value and demonstrating benefits?
So I'll give you, Lord, we only have 8 minutes left. I can't talk for, I don't want to spend all 8 minutes talking about it. We had somebody we helped yesterday that's going to present next week to their senior management, and it's the week before Christmas. Very large, very well-known organization. They said, here's what we're worried about. We're not sure what to do. We spent an hour with them, got them rolling. We have some of our larger customers who are modeling, 50 different subdivisions and hundreds or almost 1,000 different, of their critical crown jewel applications, and it took them 4 to 6 weeks to get rolling. And they got value immediately because they started the conversation. They got value immediately. They really did. That's if you're not getting value immediately, I'd argue you're probably doing something wrong.
You're doing wrong.
Is that fair, Benazir?
I would just say, I would just say 2 to 4 weeks. And 2 to 4 weeks, I'm saying that because you're going to run the quantification process, you're going to get the outcome, and you're going to make it unique to you. So it takes time to create that executive level presentation to, align and infuse some level of business operational context into the outcome. So you can get it as early as 2 weeks, and you can say 1 day if you're using something like ThreatConnect RQ. But I'll be very honest, from a services point of view, 2 to 4 weeks max for your critical apps.
That transitioned really nicely actually to our next slide, so someone's thinking ahead there. But we were talking about the components of a CRQ program, and this is where I was going to start to get a little salesy, but bear with us. So what we're really trying to demonstrate here is there is knowledge and expertise available to get you started. There are tools and platforms and technologies that can help you accelerate your speed to value. And also, if once we start those conversations, we understand a little bit more about your organization, your industry, your data, your buy-in. Once we get that context, we put it all together. That is a recipe for a resilient risk management strategy. So there is no better time to start your cyber risk quantification programs. Perfect. So there's 3 key takeaways today. Jerry, would you like to take the first one?
Yeah, start. Don't wait. Start today. Start small. You've heard us say this. I feel like we're a little bit repetitive here, but I found being repetitive is not always a bad thing. Start today. Start small. Pick something. Quantify your risk. I only promise you that it will be the beginning of the journey, and I promise you that you cannot see how this journey will progress because it'll start going in ways you didn't think of, and that's a very good thing. So please start today. Start small. That's it. I'll stop talking.
Cool.
And then if you aren't already, asking this about it, you will be. So one of the things I wanted to point out, I was reading a report about that was released by SEC about in 2019, where they were talking about creating regulation and mandates for forcing organizations to have a more disciplined, quantitative approach when it comes to cyber risk. Knowing what the landscape looks like today, it has implications right from the federal government down to private sector, right? So I think that we're going to see more and more push towards SCRQ. Use the time that you have to understand how CRQ works and start rolling it out for your critical applications. It's not difficult, it's not expensive, it's just a matter of getting started.
Well said.
Cool. And I think the real fun thing here is, you know, if you are interested in getting started, so earlier we ran that poll, it seems like quite a few of you are yet to start your journeys. If you want to see value and how quickly you can get started, because it's all well and good us giving examples of organizations we worked with, you know, why not see for yourself? Do contact us and we can create a bespoke report. We'll spend some time with you, understand a little bit more about your organization and those critical assets, and we can produce a really nice report that you can take to your board to say, you know, this is what we found, and you can begin those conversations, which I think is quite valuable. Perfect. So let's get on to the questions. Of course, if you guys do have any more, just feel free to put them in. And if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after this webinar. But we only do have a few minutes left. So one question that came in a little bit earlier, but we didn't get to, was which requires more effort, maturing cyber risks quantitative or having a robust process for handling the outliers, the 10 to 20% that don't fit into the matured risk program?
That's a good question. I think what takes more would be dealing with the outliers, because the outliers tend to be driven by parts of the business that are more challenging or resistive to change, and that by definition requires. I know Benazir's got a lot of experience in helping people do that, and I think that's where I've seen the most pain. Like, I think the journey to getting started is not as hard as it sounds, but I think that's, in my opinion, I don't know, Benazir, you might have a better answer than I do on that one.
No, I would say I think it's, you need a balance of both the approaches. You definitely need to mature your quantitative processes to derive the operational efficiency and optimization across the enterprise. You know, as you saw that chart, right? You increase the value as you move from left to right, and then you also start involving cross-functional stakeholders and enabling that shared responsibility model across the business units. So it's good to mature the cyber risk quantitative journey, but at the same time, you would have to invest in dealing with the 10 to 20% outliers as being asked in this question. Although I would like to know more about what the definition of outlier is in that question. Without understanding the outliers, I can't clearly articulately answer that. But I do believe that the mature cyber risk quantitative programs should take into consideration the one-off, and maybe that could be considered as a part of the residual risk that has to be dealt with manually. I'm not sure, but I think we need to have a little more conversation on the specific outlier definition. So at this point, Jerry, I'm not 100% sure if I'm answering the question the individual has asked in the chat window.
If you don't agree, whoever asked it, we're happy to talk about it. I think the reality is,
yeah.
I think my philosophy is it's easier to, getting started is hard, but maturing, getting that last mile, the last 2 miles is always. They say that 90% of the time you spend on something is the last 10% of the work. So
yeah,
in general, that's kind of where my head falls on this one.
Cool. Let's quickly try and see if we can get through this one last question. Someone has said we have started using quantitative methods, but still have our previous qualitative ones in place. Oh, I guess that's just a comment. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, though, Jerry or Benazir.
No.
I don't know.
No, I think a combined method I think is where majority organizations are right now, and it's not a bad thing because you're retaining your qualitative assessment, and of course qualitative assessment have their own benefits. You're not saying that you have to make everything quantitative, but having a combination of methods could potentially help you make more confident and accurate decisions, specifically in areas that require a deadlock or a contention breakdown. So I think it's not a bad idea. The question is how can you automate your quantitative process and make it more efficient rather than focus on a resource-intensive manual effort.
Great, cool. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up there. And as I said, if we haven't got to your question, we can always follow up with you after. Please do take a moment just to download the 2 data sheets we've linked for you. And if you do have a spare minute or 2, please fill out that feedback form for us. We'd love to know what you thought. And if you do want to have a call with us following this session, we can also arrange that as well. But please do look out for the recording of this webinar over the coming days, and do connect with us on LinkedIn if you're interested to hear more about cyber risk quantification. I'm sure we'll be posting a lot of content about it in the new year as well. So thank you both, Jerry and Benazir, for hosting, and thank you all for joining, and we'll see you in 2022.